Thanks very much, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Luke Timmerman, the founder and editor of Timmerman Report, and excited to engage in this conversation about serial entrepreneurship. Now, some of you may recall I wrote an article about this topic last month heading up to this conference, and I started by trying to define what a serial entrepreneur is. So these folks here who are joining me today fit that definition. And just very quickly, I thought I'd walk through this because I think people use the term entrepreneur kind of loosely or in lots of different contexts. So there's the academic founder that many of you know is sort of like a catalyst for ideas and spinning out companies out of a lab. And that's like a Bob Langer, Tim Springer, a Lee Hood. And then there's the entrepreneur who turns into a big company executive. So somebody like Len Schliefer at Regeneron or John C. Martin at Gilead, for example. And then there are folks like at venture capital firms that take ideas, give them some direction and some shape for, say, a year or two, and then bring in more permanent management, sort of like a hands-on VC. All like valuable things, part of the job of entrepreneurship. But for this, I wanted to focus on this special breed of person who kind of goes all in on a startup at an early kind of ambiguous moment and finds a way to create value when there's a million paths and it's not obvious which way to go. They tend to stay at least a few years, sell a company, get rich, and do it again. So there's a lot of people actually in the world of biotech who fit this description, but we have some excellent ones here with me today. And so I'll introduce them very, very briefly and then let them speak for just a minute or two about their history and how they've done this entrepreneurial thing once, twice, or maybe even a third time. So to my immediate right, Mike Gilman. He's currently between jobs, I think is the polite way to put it. He's done a couple startups and most likely tells me he's going to do it again. To his right, Troy Wilson. He's currently CEO of Cura Oncology. He wears a couple of other hats as well. He can tell you about that, but he's had a couple successful companies on his resume before Cura. And on the far end, Tilman Gerngross. He is currently the CEO of Adimab, and his first act was Glycophy, and can tell us about that. So maybe, Mike, you just wanted to like expand a little bit on your record as a serial entrepreneur?
Yeah, my record. So I'm a scientist by training. I'm a PhD in biochemistry and actually still probably a scientist by wiring diagram. And was an academic for a number of years, crossed over, to the dark side about 20 years ago and worked at a couple of different biotech companies and ended up as at Biogen, where I was running the discovery research organization. And it was at that point, I guess, that I got a little, I got a little fed up with big company life, and so I kind of quit and I had no idea what it meant to be an entrepreneur, but I had like sort of nothing else to do, and I started kind of poking around, was introduced to members of the venture capital community here in the Boston area, hooked up with the folks at Atlas Venture who were in Cambridge, and based on an interesting afternoon of conversation, decided we wanted to start a company focused on fibrosis. This was 11 years ago now, and that actually, and so I had no idea what that meant exactly. They gave me an office and they said, "Figure it out, let us know." And so I did, and this turned into a real company. It was called Strometics. It actually acquired an antibody from Biogen that Biogen had given up on, advanced it to phase 2 in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, at which point Biogen decided they'd like to have it back. So they acquired the company. So I went back to Biogen actually at a lower level than I'd left, so that whole thing was a long, complicated path to a demotion. I left Biogen again after about a year and a half, and actually did it a second time. I went right back to Atlas and asked them what they were working on, found this really interesting piece of science that turned into this company called Padlock Therapeutics, which was focused on autoimmune disease. And that company really was only around for about a year and a half when it got acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb just this past April. And so now I'm either unemployed or retired or between jobs. I haven't quite figured it out.
That was a big shift to go from an antibody company to a different modality, and then different disease categories. So but there were some lessons learned about entrepreneurship, which we can talk about. Troy.
So I'm Troy Wilson. As Luke mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of Kura Oncology. Kura is a company that's focused in the area of precision medicines, all small molecules. The lead program is actually one that we out-licensed from Johnson & Johnson. It's, for those of you who've been in the industry, it's a farnesyltransferase inhibitor. We just released some really interesting top-line data in squamous cell head and neck cancer. So I think we might actually finally see farnesyltransferase inhibitors deliver on the promise of 10 or 15 years ago. I'm also the president and CEO of two other companies. One of them is called Wellspring Biosciences. The other is called Avidity Biosciences. Wellspring Biosciences is a company that we created to drug the KRAS G12C mutant oncoprotein. We never raised any outside funding. It's entirely owned by its founders and employees, and it's a very large build-to-buy arrangement with J&J. It stays very quiet. There's only one or two press releases out there, and I would point you to its parent company called Araxis Pharma. So that's ongoing. Wellspring and Kura actually have a relationship with one another, where Wellspring does early drug discovery and Kura does development. My third company is Avidity Biosciences, and that's an idea that I'm very passionate about. It's antibody siRNA conjugates. So take this idea of antibody drug conjugates and extend it now where the payload is an oligonucleotide. I was formerly the president and CEO of Intellikine, which we started out of UCSF in 2007, and which Takeda acquired in the beginning of 2012. Prior to that, I spent time at Novartis, started a number of other companies. These are just the last four, and have a PhD in bioorganic chemistry and also a corporate finance and securities law background. So the thing that I'm probably most well qualified to do is to be a serial entrepreneur, and appreciate the opportunity to join you, Luke, today.
Do you use the term recovering lawyer?
I do use recovering lawyer and recovering chemist, both actually. Yeah.
All right, Tillman.
Yeah, so I'm Tillman Gurngros. I'm a bioengineer I'm a professor of bioengineering at Dartmouth College. And I started my first company in 2000 to solve a particular problem that was perceived to be important at the time, which is how do you make therapeutic glycoproteins at a lower cost point, but more importantly, control the glycosylation, because it was starting to be understood that the sugars on proteins actually have a pretty big effect of what their therapeutic potential is. And that company ended up being acquired 6 years later by Merck. And in 2007, I started an antibody discovery company called Adimab that then pursued a somewhat different model where we developed a technology to discover antibodies and bispecific molecules, but we're not developing our own drugs at all. In fact, we view ourselves as the people that turn insight in biology into drugs. So people come with a biological hypothesis, and then they ask the question, can you give us antibodies that meet very specific criteria of modulating the biology they wish to affect in the hope of ultimately developing a drug? And so that company's about 100 employees. It's been around for almost 10 years and is a profitable, privately held biotech company. In 2010, I founded a company called Arsanis with Esther Nagy, and that company seeks to develop precision therapeutics in the infectious disease arena, almost exclusively based on antibodies. And that company is about to launch its phase 2 trials in the next month or two. And then in 2011, I founded a company called Avidity, and Avidity was founded with two former postdocs and grad students of mine, Kevin Isett and Warren Kett and John Scheller. And that company develops affinity purification resins for any biotherapeutics. So if you want to purify a vaccine, if you want to purify any sort of DNA delivery vector, we develop specific resins to purify that over everything else that may be in the feed stream that leads to the production of those various modalities. And again, that company is very much mirroring the AdamApp business model of providing a service, but based on a proprietary capability. So it means we solve problems that people care about, but we end up getting a royalty on the back end if indeed we're successful in these partnerships. And then finally, in 2012, I founded a company called Elector with Arnon Rosenthal, the former founder of Renat Neuroscience that Pfizer acquired in 2006. And Arnon and I founded this company with a similar idea of approaching the sort of most recent insights in what leads to neurodegeneration by coming up with antibody-based therapies to attenuate or delay or address these types of situations where what appears to be now a sort of similar situation that we've seen in oncology, where the immune system not being entirely able of clearing debris over the long run leads to diseases that we're all pretty familiar with, but modulating that aspect of the immune system is a new angle that we're hoping to advance to the clinic in the next year or two. And that's pretty much it. Back
Great.
to you, Luke.
Thanks, Tillman. So I guess when I look at each of you guys, I see individuals who have domain expertise in a given thing. I mean, you followed a traditional path, going through graduate school, get your PhD, become an expert at something. And you could have gone down a lot of different roads. Could have been, at a big pharma company by now, I suppose, or maybe in academia. But you keep coming back to these startups where you're not renewing your grants every few years at NIH. It's not the cushiest gig. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of ambiguity. What draws you to these kind of situations? What are the what are the personality traits or defects?
I'll take a crack and then leave it to my two colleagues here to add to that. I would say, at a very high level, what starting your own company affords you is an opportunity to impose your value systems on a narrowly defined universe, namely the company. And we all have certain views of how things should be and how they shouldn't be, and companies are actually great vehicles of promoting values, in particular if they're merit-based, and in particular if they're performance-based. So that's one aspect that I think is really interesting, because you can create these mini societies almost that have a very clear objective of what the outcome is. And if you recruit the right people, it leads to really a phenomenal culture that in itself is intoxicating, I would say. So take away the money, take away the success, the culture and the environment you're able to create is not something you can create in academia or in any other venue, as far as I know.
So you like the power to do it the Tillman way.
It's not the power, it's the culture and the energy that comes from people working with one another. I'm not the best at anything. In fact, the beauty is you surround yourself with people that are really very good at their own respective domains, and it's my job to assemble a group of people that collectively do extraordinary things when each one of them is doing the job way better than I could ever do it. So it's not about the power, it's about creating that environment where you realize you rely on one another, and if that's done right, again, I think it leads to a lot of positive energy, and that's what I find particularly intriguing. And we'll get into this a little bit later. I think that's one of the reasons I do things differently than perhaps Tim or Bob Langer, right? That they like to sort of start the company. They're involved at some level, but they're not really down in the guts of it, of who gets hired, who runs. They aren't there every day.
They're also not quitting their day job and taking that same degree of risk.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not completely quitting my day job either, but for me, it's very important to be there on a very regular basis and be intimately involved in the choice of people and making sure that that culture thing gets done right. And I'd be curious to hear what Mike and Troy have to say about that.
Personality traits of a serial entrepreneur.
So maybe just to amplify on Tillman's comments, I mean, what you find in large companies are incredibly smart people, great science, and in my experience, a significant amount of bureaucracy. What you find in academia is sort of breathtakingly cool science, limited resources. You're always having to write grants. Startups kind of bridge those two worlds. You've got incredibly smart people who have, done both terrific science and actually moved therapies or technologies forward into patients, but you have a culture where you can move very quickly in response to data, right? And you can marshal resources, whether they be human capital, financial capital, and be able to move with incredible speed when you get data. And I don't know of any other environment that has the sheer excitement of science, because I'm a total data junkie, and all of my employees will tell you that. But also, when you really need to move quickly, you've got people who've done it before. You can get the capital, you can get the folks around the table, and in an afternoon, you can pivot and change course and go quickly.
Well, you need to. I mean, the venture capital is not going to be there forever. So, I mean, the pressure's on, right?
The pressure's always on.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure. I don't have a whole lot to add. I would point out that I did quit my day job, so to do it. So at some level, you have to have at least a certain amount of risk tolerance, at least to do it the first time. I think having done it twice now, which by the way makes me a slacker compared to these guys. I actually don't think it's that risky, because I actually think you are very much more in control of your own fate than you are in a larger organization. And to me, I think so I would emphasize the clarity of focus and mission that is very unique to that environment. I would echo what Tillman said about the sort of the alchemy of building teams, which I think is one of the things that just draws me back again and again. For me personally, it turns out I kind of love the lack of structure. It's a relatively unstructured environment. I love being closer to the real work. I am not cut out to sit on committees, for example, and I think as a scientist, I don't know if you guys feel the same way, that actually the most challenging transition was turning from a specialist into a generalist, right? That as an academic scientist, your job is to basically learn more and more and more about less and less and less, essentially. Whereas your job as an entrepreneur is to deal with whatever the hell happens, whether you've done it before or not. And that's kind of thrilling, actually. And but it's probably not thrilling for everybody, which is, I think, why some people really love this and do well at it, and others maybe don't.
I think that's an important point you raised there about a structured environment, because some people are just naturally better suited for a more structured environment, and others do better in the more freewheeling kind of place. And I would say that for myself, coming up as a journalist in bigger organizations where there's a lot of structure. I kind of found it hard sometimes to get my point across in meetings, or get the big boss to listen to me, or I found I was impatient or get frustrated. And then I went to a much more unstructured environment and was able to follow my own instincts and did pretty well, or found that suited me, I enjoyed it, and I did better.
Well, just to add one other thing to that, because so to me that is the sort of the higher level analysis, but there's a lower level analysis too, right? Which is you have to be the kind of person who likes, like unjamming the printer and rebooting the router and all that sort of stuff, because you're not going to have a staff to do it. And, I've seen people move to little companies from big companies, and just being completely stumped because there's no help desk when they're having trouble with Microsoft Word, you know? And it's just a very, very different way of working.
Yeah. What about, now each of you guys has done this more than once. Talk about some of those kind of first impressions from the first go round and lessons learned at company 2.
So one of the 2 lessons I learned from the first time I was a CEO was Intellikine. And Intellikine was a traditional venture-backed company, you know, the classic A-round syndicate of large venture firms. And I realized very quickly, you know, you bring these boards of directors together, these people, and one is you need to have a no a-hole rule, right? I learned that very quickly, because you're going to spend a lot of time with these people, and they can either make your life easier or make it very, very difficult.
So first-time entrepreneur is probably often looking for the smartest person you possibly can get for that job.
Or they're just looking for money, and they don't know, you know, they don't know to ask the question of, you know, this person's going to be with you minimum 4 or 5 years, right? And I was fortunate, but you know, there were some bumps along the way. The other thing that you learn very quickly as an entrepreneur is, you know, these companies are not a democracy. You have to have strong leadership. The startups thrive if you're able to make crisp decisions with incomplete information. You're never going to be able to, you know, commission a McKinsey survey. You're never going to be able to do enough experiments to make some of the key decisions that you have to make. And so your ability to analyze that, to pull all the information together, and then to bring all of your colleagues, both employees, investors, potentially partners, you know, if you don't learn that quickly, you're not going to succeed. I was fortunate. I had some good mentors on the Intellikine board who really helped me through it, but I've taken a lot of those lessons now into subsequent companies.
How about you, Tillman?
I would just say that I think you learn what your job actually is, because the first time you do it, like, you think the board is who you report to, and of course they're important because they're typically the people that give you money, and so you're very focused of like what they think. But they have their own agenda, they want their own stuff, right? And I think the more often you sort of do it, or at least I've learned over time, that they're just one piece of the puzzle. At the end of the day, your job as the CEO is to make sure that the alignment of interest is as effective as possible. That means between the people that give you money, that are on your board, the people that work for you, that are employed by you, and then in most cases, when you have partnerships with third parties, in which we have a lot of, making sure they're part of the equation too. So really, and again, when you're the first-time CEO, it's like, can I raise enough money? And you're already happy when you can do that. And so I think you have a much more limited view of the world, that over time you realize your job is actually a very different job. So I think really understanding what the job is what I didn't really understand until I was in company number 2.
Well, I suppose it gets easier because if you've had success with company number 1, it's a little easier to raise money for company number 2.
There's no question that in our industry, the failure rate is so high that when you're a first-time CEO, it's much more difficult. And if you've been successful once as a founder, raising money the second and third and the fourth time is a lot easier, particularly if these companies have done well.
Well, could you expand a little bit on these mistakes that the first-timers make? Because I would imagine there might be a few out here in the audience, or people thinking about it at least. And Troy, we talked about this as well, that notion that get as much money as you can while you can. It can be conventional wisdom, but it can really lead you astray.
I mean, I get a lot of, you know, people who come to me and ask for advice, and they're not even really first-time CEOs. They're entrepreneurs. They have an idea. They want to start a company, and I counsel them on 3 things, because I see the same 3 mistakes over and over again. And Tillman and Mike may feel the same or may feel differently. They are, you know, do you really have a company? Number 1, what do you actually have, right? Is it something you should license? Should it really be an independent company? I think you have to really step back and ask yourself that question. If you survive that, then things always take longer. They're always more complicated. You will always need more money. I see people who want to raise only as much money as they think they need to get to some mythical value inflection point. The reality is, for anyone who's ever done science, nothing ruins a good plan like data, right? So I always counsel people, raise more money and be open with it, right? The third is get a good syndicate of investors. Don't rely on one investor. Get a group of people, because things happen in these, as Tillman said, in these venture capital firms and even with strategic investors, priorities change, people change. And so you don't want to be beholden to one constituent. And suddenly something happens in their world and it blows back on you and you have no control over it. So those are the three things I would say that I've learned both in my own experience and from just watching either successes or things that were, implosions.
Now, are there some good places to turn for people looking at this? Because, I've heard a couple people say, Mike and Katrine Bosley told me this too, like there's no rule book, there's no guidebook for this. And there's a lot of like misconceptions or ignorance really about basic things when you raise money, like liquidation preferences, that, the VC firms get their money back first. And you need to know that. You also need to know the VC fund life cycles of the members of your syndicate. Like if some guy needs that payoff in 2 years and another needs it in 5, that's a big difference and can cause some tension on your board and influence your decisions. So, I mean, do you just handle these things on an ad hoc basis, or is there like a place that people can go and like really learn this other than, Harvard Business School will cost you, 6 figures?
Yeah, you're not going to learn that stuff at Harvard Business School. So when I was starting Strometics, which was the first company, once we'd sort of secured the asset and we were like kind of ready to go and like turn it into a real company, suddenly there was all this stuff that I had to learn about and worry about, like insurance and just all kinds of sort of infrastructure stuff. And I went to the VC I was working with and I said, so is there like a checklist, I mean, isn't there some, because every company kind of needs like the same set of things. And he said, oh no, we just kind of send you to the last guy who had to figure it out. And it's true that this stuff is not rocket science, and actually it would do the ecosystem, maybe this is my retirement project actually, it would do the ecosystem a great service to really write a primer. Here are the things that you need to do to actually start a company. Here are the things you need to do to raise capital. Here are the questions you should be asking about your investors. Because you get that in bits and pieces, and certainly you get a lot of advice if you talk to people, but man, there's no better way to learn it than to make the mistakes and live with the consequences. And so I think the challenge is, excuse me, to tap into the experience of people who have done it before.
Tillman, you must get a lot of people asking you for advice. I mean, especially wearing the academic hat at Dartmouth.
Yeah, I do, yes. But I think, again, every situation is very situational. There is not like this template, you do all these things and you'll be fine. In fact, what Troy said, in some cases is absolutely true. Raise as much money as possible, depending on the risk though. Because raising money early on means you're raising money at a lower valuation. If you have a pretty clear idea of how you're going to increase valuation, whether it's all of a sudden you're signing up a bunch of partners, you know that's going to happen, or you're very confident, I wouldn't raise more money, I would raise less. But that's, again, a very specific situation. So the problem that I see is there's lots of opinions. You'll get plenty of opinions for free, but which ones actually are meaningful and will help you build a great company, and which ones are just, people telling you what they experienced, and it's not really applicable to your situation. So I think you sort of have to build the case from first principles yourself. And that's ultimately what makes you successful. Just listening to other people and doing what they told you is unlikely to lead to a successful outcome, is my read. I don't know if you agree, Troy and Mike.
No, maybe I should clarify my comment. Whether you get money from investors, from partners, you're getting money, right? You're selling some percentage of the business or the asset to someone else. And my point is, I think people often have a rosy view on how things are going to go. So I'm completely in agreement. We've been very fortunate with my company, Wellspring. We never raised $1 of venture capital. The founders put the first $1 million in, and every dollar after that came from J&J. And what's important about that, and I know Tillman has had a similar experience, is as an entrepreneur, you don't understand, the first time around, you don't understand the implication of dilution until you've been all the way through. So you may see a company sold for $300 or $400 million, but then ask yourself, how much of that did the employees actually get, right? And it's usually, I mean, in a really best case scenario, it's 20%. So a $300 million sale, that means $60 million went to the employees. Now, if you own the entire enchilada and you sell it for $100 million, you're better off. And that's what I mean by saying, think very critically about, what do I have? What should I do with it? Venture capital may not actually be your best route. It may be better to find a partner or to find some other mechanism to fund it. But I think you have to ask yourself the really hard questions and just pressure test it.
Completely agree. So all these things completely resonate, and I've given people similar advice.
Well, and there are a lot of misconceptions about fundraising, as in the more is better, and actually, if you look at, say, Mike's last example, if he had raised $100 million for Padlock and sold it for 500, well, that's a pretty good exit. But what made that thing such a success is that you only put, or there was something like 18 or 20 million in. Yeah, so now the multiple looks really good.
But so again, the take-home message here really is, you have to think about capital efficiency, and you have to think about it at two levels. All the investors and the people that go to work every day. There are two different buckets, and they will approach it in very different ways. And you have to understand what their incentives are and what the incentives of the people that go to work every day are.
Well, let's talk about that. As the CEO, you've got internal constituencies and external, if you want to call the board external. You got to manage both. How do you divvy up your time and your focus on those two groups?
I think if you set it up right from the beginning and you understand that your job is to align interest and make sure that everyone is treated fairly, then life afterwards becomes easy. Because if all the systems and the relationships are set in place in the right way, look, for example, I am sympathetic to the notion of a liquidation preference in the following scenario. It's a 1x non-participating liquidation preference, meaning that if you put money in and things go south, yes, and we have to liquidate the equipment, you should get your money before everyone else. But other than that, once there's excess value generated over the money that went in, there's no double dipping. So there's no participation, there's no multiples. That's at least my position. So I would never do a deal with any multiple in participating liquidation preference.
Yeah, we could really talk about this. That's very VC friendly and non-entrepreneur friendly, non-startup.
You mean
employee.
the 3x participating?
Yeah, 3x.
Yeah, but again, it goes back to the example you had before. You can have a $300 million exit. The investors put in $100 million and have a 3x participating liquidation preference. The preferred gets zero, nothing.
Yeah, but you have to, I
You
mean,
mean the common gets nothing?
I'm sorry, the common, yes.
Yeah. That being the entrepreneur and the startup employees, they think, wow, we sold this company for $300 million.
Well,
They're like,
even more embarrassing, their
they get
friends will
nothing.
say to them, oh my God, you're going to buy yourself a new house or something? No, we won't, because we in fact just lost our job.
right, I'm unemployed and I'm going to try and get a job at Pfizer down the street. Yeah.
but you have to, I'm sorry, Mike.
Well, maybe you should go, because I was going to I have sort of I may be a little bit of a Pollyanna when it comes to this particular issue, because my view is that in our business, life sciences, but particularly drug development, the outcomes are pretty binary, right? You either create a ton of value or you go to zero. There are very few sort of situations in between. And honestly, my view is, if you have a very clear view of what it actually takes to create and demonstrate that value, and you are sort of ruthlessly focused on that, and you're very good at articulating that so that everybody around you sort of understands what that value is, then if you succeed, everybody does fine. Right now, that's maybe easy for me to say, because I've been through a couple of successful exits where everybody walked away happy, but they walked away happy because we actually delivered on the thing we were trying to do. So I guess I would say my focus tends to be a little bit more sort of internally on how do you, for the team, how do you build the team, how do you articulate the value proposition, and how do you just stay laser focused on making it happen?
But I'll just add a complication to this. Like when you're trying to hire someone, right? First of all, most scientists are not very sophisticated at this at all. They'll say, like, my friends told me I should ask for 10,000 shares. It means nothing, because the question is, how many total outstanding shares are there?
They don't know the percentage.
They don't understand percentage in this context, okay? But even percentage doesn't mean anything, because I can give you 0.4% of the shares in common shares, but if there's so much structure on the preferred shares, that 0.4% upon an exit becomes 0.04%. And I just don't think that's fair. That's not aligning interest. That's screwing people.
Well, that's totally fair game for employees to ask when taking a job.
Okay,
Like,
tell me
right?
which company discloses a full cap table and the terms for each investment
They
round
don't,
when
but
they
they-
hire people? Nobody.
They
Well, we
should.
would if they asked. I mean, I would
they
if
should.
they asked.
Well, you and I would ask because we've seen it, but the normal guy that just, finishes his PhD and gets his first job will never ask that question because they don't know it. They don't know what to ask.
Right. They believe that the stock options are a lottery ticket when they really ought to be asking a few more questions before taking that job.
The value of what they're
Stock options
given
are
is
a lottery
unknown.
ticket, actually. The stock options are a lottery ticket because of the fact that we are in a jackpot business, right? And what I tell employees is, I will explain, share all that math with them, right? Because I think it's important that people understand that. But I will also tell them, take this piece of paper, put it in the deepest, darkest drawer in your file cabinet, and forget it's there, right? Because chances are it's going to be worth nothing, but one day you may wake up and it's worth a lot. And I actually think, particularly for scientists, that most scientists take jobs at companies like this. I mean, we are uncomplicated creatures as scientists, right? People take jobs mostly because they are really, really in love with the science, that they really.
I totally agree with you, but I just think that I perceive it as more sophisticated people taking advantage of less sophisticated people when it comes to these
that's
financial
true.
issues.
That's
And
true.
I don't like that. And when I say alignment of interest, when I tell someone, you own 0.4% of this company, I want to be able to look that person in the eye and say, if we ever exit at a valuation that is above the money that went into the company, that's how much you're going to own. And there's no if, buts, and not some other thing that's going to go on afterwards. And they look at it and say, well, what happened?
I totally 100% agree with Tillman. If as an entrepreneur, you can't take your capitalization table, which is the table of what everyone in the company owns, right? The investors, the employees, anybody else, and figure out what everybody's going to get under scenarios that go from zero to jackpot, you're not doing your job, right? You have to understand those legal documents mean something. And, investors are trying to get the best deal they can. They're not going to be shy about it. They will come and tell you that a 3x participating preferred is industry standard.
They will say it's NVCA standard, which is their organization representing them. It's the most ridiculous argument.
It may be the 2009 standard.
But that takes me to my second point, which is as an entrepreneur and ultimately as a CEO, you also have a responsibility to run as many options as you can, because the only leverage you have with people is the ability not to do a deal with them. Tillman you don't have to do a deal with anybody, right? He can drive very hard terms because he's successful. So again, don't put all the eggs in one basket. Whether, no matter how many glowing platitudes an investor or partner gives you, have a backup plan, and have a backup plan to the backup plan. Because I have a saying in my companies, until the money's been wired into our account and we've wired it into another account so they can't take it back, it's not your money, right? Don't trust anyone. That's the best advice I can give you. And then you can honestly say, you know what? I heard from a couple of people that have done this before that a 1x participating preferred is what I should be asking for. You don't like it, I'm going to go over here and do it this way. It's a lot more work for you as an entrepreneur, but it will absolutely pay off huge dividends in the end.
I'm picking up on a theme here of being straight with people, and that, maybe that isn't always the case, but it's important if you want these people to come to work motivated, know what they're doing, maybe work with you again.
But this is the power of that is also what incents you to do it again, because you end up building a very loyal following of people that will want to work with you over and over again, and you know that they're really good. And again, most first-time entrepreneurs see it as capital is the limiting thing. I tell you, it's not. Once you're through that, talent is the most limiting thing. And when you have access to a broad network of very talented people across all the things you need to do right, whether it's finance, legal, IP, HR, and the science, if you can draw from a rich network of people that want to work with you, it's so much easier to set up companies.
Well, and this builds off something you said earlier, which was that, the spotlight is on you guys as the CEO. I mean, the lights are on you right now. We pay a lot of attention to the CEOs and strategic direction, but this is a team sport, and nobody's the expert in everything. I mean, you know that better than anybody. And so, but people, getting the good ones and getting rid of the bad ones. Troy, you mentioned earlier, no assholes rule. Can you talk, without naming names or anything, about a situation? How do you excise the tumor, so to speak, if you really got to?
So if it's at the board level, it's really hard. It's it's like when you have an abscess, you have to sort of just wall it off, right, and hope it goes away. Not going to happen. I would say the other thing I have learned is I hire a lot of people that I've worked with before because I know them, I trust them. There's a history there. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it, be fair with people, be open, but also take corrective action as quickly as you possibly can. Because we all make mistakes, and I've made mistakes in hiring. The fit hasn't been quite right, and it's nothing personal, but you have to act decisively and say, and you can get great advice from people in HR, from sometimes from your advisors or your board members, but you need to act very quickly. Board level is much, much harder.
But nobody likes to fire people unless...
No, but that's your job. I mean, your job is to set the culture of the organization and to make sure that everyone is aligned around a common set of goals. And, if usually the issue is, the issue that I've had in my experience is it's very rarely a lack of technical competence. It's almost always a cultural problem. It's someone who doesn't play well with others. You have to keep putting them in the corner, and after a while you're like, this is just dragging on everybody else. And then that's a violation of the culture, and you are the chief culture officer. You're responsible to set that, and if you don't deal with it, you lose the respect of everyone who reports to you.
Conflict avoidance, big flaw. If you avoid conflict, you're probably not ready for this kind of job. Right?
I completely agree with Troy, but I would challenge your statement that nobody likes to fire people. Donald Trump likes to fire people.
Well, okay? I thought about that, but then I thought better.
But I think Troy described it really well. There's tension between the culture you wish to create, and there are people that will undermine that, and you have a choice. You either avoid making the right decision, but your culture will suffer. So it's your choice. Do you want to be complacent, or do you want to take action and preserve something that you think ultimately is a key driver to value? And I think once you realize that, you just have to take the right action and do the things that you may not want to do, but have to do. And the other thing that, this is never like on a single date, you're like, okay, today I'm going to fire the guy. It's always the same sort of story that plays out, right? First, you try to change the people, and then you have to change the people. In other words, you have to fire them and bring someone else in because you don't succeed in that. And I would say the success rate of trying to change people's behavior, in my experience, 10, 15%. I don't know what you guys think, but.
I mean, do you warn people and lay out a plan to improve and all that kind of stuff? I mean, lawyers tell you got to do that, right?
It's not just a legal matter. It's just you want to deal with them at a human level, right? Hey, this isn't going to work here because X, Y, and Z. This violates the values that we all signed up for, and you're not doing that. You say that once, you say it twice, you say it 3 times, and at some point you say, it's not working out.
Troy, you also mentioned people having a kind of a rosy set of expectations at the outset. And of course, you have to be optimistic, believe you can conquer all obstacles to even start a company. But overconfidence is a problem too. How do you guys keep the egos in check?
I mean, for me personally, it's not ego as much as sort of unbridled optimism. A couple times we've brought in some really exciting stuff out of academia, and it just, you're 6 or 9 months in and you're like, holy shit, it doesn't repeat, right? And that's nobody's fault. It is what it is. So I think being very clear about what success looks like, and I'm the first person to say, if it didn't work, I take responsibility, but let's recognize it and move on. And that goes back to having a very clear set of goals, having very clear either go, no-go criteria, kill criteria, whatever you want to think about it. I try to get buy-in from the folks on my team up front. Because once you've done all the experiments, you can always convince yourself that there's hope there. But if you say, it has to have the following attributes, and if it doesn't, it just doesn't make sense to go forward, then it's nobody's fault. You did the right experiment, you got the data, and as a team you move on. Well, that's how you put it. That's how you take the ego out of it.
Well, that's failing fast rather than failing slow and inexpensively.
Sometimes it takes a long time to fail. But if you set the criteria in the right place, if you need an oral formulation and you can't get there, that you tried. You gave it your best shot.
I know I want time for questions from the audience. It's a little hard to see, but I think we have microphones out there. If people just want to raise their hand, we can get you one. What about dealing with, while we're waiting for that, what advice do you have for the first timers in terms of dealing with boards? Because, they're going to be different. They're going to have their own dynamics depending on your syndicate. But, that's one thing that, definitely nobody teaches you in Harvard Business School.
Dealing with boards. I could go on about this one at some length, actually, because that's exactly right. No matter what route you take to this role, that's the one part you will have never done before, and it's an important part of the job. I guess what I would say now, having done it a couple of times, and plus actually being on the other side, being on a number of boards, is first of all, start with something, Tillman, you said about 20 minutes ago, which is, yeah, they're your boss in theory, but don't treat them like they're your boss, right? You're the one who is in charge of running the company. You're the one in charge of making critical management decisions. If they don't like it, they can fire you, right? That's their job. Their job is to hire you, fire you, and make decisions about your compensation. Beyond that, actually, it's not their job to manage the company. And I didn't really understand that the first time I did this, and that could turn into a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole, right? Because if you have 5 different people on the board, and each one of them is wanting you to do something different, and by the way, each one of them is wanting you to do something different than what they wanted you to do at the last board meeting, and you can just be kind of driven nuts about that. And I think one of the things I've learned is that and I'm thinking now about it, investor directors, right? So most investors, you are just one in a portfolio of companies that they have responsibility for. They have a limited amount of mind share to give to your company, and actually they're looking for you to lead them. They're looking for you to tell them what the company should do. Now, they have the right to poke at it and ask questions, and again, in the limit, if they think you're doing a crappy job, to just toss you out and bring in somebody else. But my advice to a first-time entrepreneur, with the acknowledgement that it's extremely difficult for a first-time entrepreneur to do this, is, be strong with your board, stand up to them, draw lines in the sand. Don't be afraid to say to them, that's micromanagement, that is a management issue, that is not a board-level issue.
Don't give them the minutia. Okay, I think
There's a question here.
Yeah, right here in the front, Laura.
So now that you guys have done it more than once, what do you view as the process for deciding whether you really do have a company, whether you really do have something that you want to pour the next 3, 5, 7, however many years of your life into?
maybe I'll take that one because I'm going through that process right now. So I think it's probably different for everybody. As I think we've talked about a few times, I'm like no longer sort of a subject matter expert, like on anything. So I'm not going to be the guy who comes up with the idea to start the company, but I've learned to trust my intuition, my scientific intuition, and I'm a lover of biology. I really, truly just love biology. And so what's worked for me in the past and will continue to work for me, I will continue to use, is to I just sit and listen. I just expose myself to as many, there's lots of interesting things going on, particularly in an environment like this. There are just so many fascinating ideas, great new science, moving very quickly. I just kind of like let it sort of wash over me until I sort of fall in love with something, and then I go.
Other questions?
I just add
Oh, yeah,
one thing
Tillman.
to that, and I see that a lot in academia. Is this working?
Yeah.
That people just happen to be doing certain work, and then the question emerges like, should this be a company? In most cases, that's the wrong question, because the things that I get interested in start with someone's problem. Because if you understand where there are currently limitations and you have some level of confidence that you can come up with something that solves that, that's already way more interesting than someone having a solution that is chasing for a problem. And in academia, I see mostly, the vast majority is solutions looking for problems, and not the other way around. I think you should start with a problem and then figure out how do you bring together the people that will help you solve that problem. And scientists have this, this instinct that when there's a problem, they immediately want to jump on it and solve it. They're like greyhounds, following as long as it's fuzzy and moves, it's got to be a rabbit. Well, it's not that way, actually. Not every problem needs to be solved. And you have to really spend time thinking about what does the capital and the people that you're going to bring in to solve this problem, what does that really do in terms of solving something that someone values and ultimately is willing to pay for? Again, there are lots of problems that you can solve that no one's going to pay for. And if no one else is paying for it, you can't finance it. So,
You don't want to learn that after 6 months on the investment trail.
yeah.
Yeah. Other question right here.
Hi. First of all, thank you for a terrific discussion, exceptionally helpful. What would be your advice to a first-time entrepreneur such as myself in terms of what capabilities, what functions do you build in-house versus what do you outsource, and especially in a pre-Series B type situation where resources can be significantly limited?
So obviously it depends a little bit on what the nature of the program is, but I'm a big fan of outsourcing as much as possible, right? Because, as Tillman has said, you need to be, ruthlessly efficient with your capital. And one of the sort of practical sort of interpretations of that piece of advice is keep your fixed costs to a minimum, right? Make everything as much as possible into a variable cost. And so, a lot of the sort of back office stuff can all be outsourced, right? I mean, you probably don't need a full-time finance person, and like, God forbid you should have an HR person, right? I mean, that is where these companies start going wrong. No offense to any HR professionals in the room. And then, we, at Padlock, we were really just like 5 people for most of the time. We added a few just in the last 6 weeks before we got acquired. But we outsourced actually we outsourced all of our wet lab science, all of it. And you can do that today, right? I mean, the CRO ecosystem is really, really very strong. And I'm a big fan of that, but you soon recognize, you have to ask yourself, what piece of this project is so critically important to me that actually we need to do it ourselves. And sometimes it takes a while to figure out what that is, actually.
hearing you talk about just now about fixed costs versus variable costs, I had to laugh because I thought, well, you probably didn't cover that sort of stuff at Cold Spring Harbor.
No.
But it raises a point that, as a CEO, you need to be kind of an omnivorous reader. Maybe this is like a self-serving plug as a journalist, but you need to read a lot from a lot of different kinds of sources, right, to kind of broaden your view of business, science.
Yeah, although honestly, I would say a lot of this stuff is actually common sense. I forget the name of that book. Everything that I know, I learned in kindergarten or whatever it is. I mean, that's kind of how I feel, right? That there's a lot of technical stuff that you need to figure out, but it turns out there's plenty of people around here who know it, where you can source that expertise from. And really, what's being, the key to success in our business is pretty simple stuff, right? I mean, it's being clear about what you're trying to do. It's being transparent with people. It's telling the truth. You don't have to actually read up a lot to learn those things, I don't think.
I like that for your reading list. Everything I need to know, I learn in kindergarten. Another question here in the middle.
Hello. Hi, I'm Linda Fong from Yale University. I had a question about the strategy early on when you are beginning a startup. I know, Troy, you mentioned a build-to-buy business, whereas with Adimab, I think you guys turned down licensing offers and decided to build the platform as an individual company. How did you think about that process and strategize there moving forward?
So I'll take a crack at that because I can sort of contrast my three companies. With Wellspring, we had a really big, hard problem. We wanted to develop a small molecule drug candidate against KRAS. That's a $100 million problem, but it's going to come in stages, right? You're going to do discovery work, and then it's going to slowly kind of crank along. But it's a $100 million problem. You're either going to raise that from pharma or venture. There's no angel option there. The build to buy is nice because, and actually just as a slight tweak, we didn't do a build to buy, we did a build to license. So J&J actually has an option to license the program at the end of phase 1. And then if they do that, they continue to pay milestone payments and a royalty. The beauty of that is my employees, if we're successful, will continue to get a check every quarter for the next 20 years, right? And that's nice. Avidity is, we actually, I read everything I could about Adimab, and we've tried to model it. It's not exactly the same, but that I think makes a ton of sense. It's a platform-based technology. We're looking to do drug discovery for other companies. And I think, it goes to something that both Tillman and Mike said. What is it that you're providing? Are you providing a product? Are you providing a service? Are you, and then you back out of that and you think about, okay, what's the right structure? Ideally, you maximize employee ownership, you maximize control, you maximize fun, and you just, and ideally you have kind of got multiple options and you can choose among them. But there is no one size fits all. It's very much about trying to find the right business structure to fit whatever it is that you're building, whatever that startup may look like.
Maybe
I
Tillman, you want to talk about Adimab?
Just one piece, because if it's a company that is trying to develop an asset, the ownership of that asset or the value around that asset can only be financed through exactly the mechanisms that Troy described. You either sell shares in the company to advance the program, or you find ways of partnering, and partners are going to want a piece of the action, otherwise they wouldn't be giving you money. So in other words, there's the constant trade-off. It's just, am I selling equity, or am I selling ownership in the molecule? Or am I giving away geographic rights? I mean, there are different ways of slicing that pie. That is very different than a platform, because what a platform allows you to do is, I can sell it to you, and I can turn around and sell it to another guy, and you have that person use the platform. In fact, I can sell it to 30 guys, or women for that matter, and I'm not compromising the value by giving it to one. In fact, in the case of Adimab, it's becoming a competitive advantage now. If you're doing antibody discovery, and you have the Adimab platform, you are most likely going to be able to beat other people that are not using that platform, certainly in certain areas of biology. And so what it does is it actually makes a lot of people want the platform, and you don't have to compromise. I don't have to give anything up by giving it to one person. In fact, I can monetize that event. And so that's the big difference. I think it's platform versus assets that afford you different business models. So when the question comes, what strategy would you follow? Again, the first and most important thing is understand what your business is. Because it's the opportunity that you have that informs you of how to structure the business plan. You don't go into it with a business plan, at least I don't. You have to kind of figure out where's your value add? And then you start thinking about how do you monetize or how do you finance that to build value for you and the other shareholders that are back in the company.
Well, and I don't want to belabor this. We've talked about this before, but the experience at the first company and sort of the earlier generation antibody companies informed you that, you can build a platform and then sell it to one company. Yep. And maybe that company does something with it pretty cool, like in the case of BMS with Metarex, but maybe not. Maybe they just bottle it up and kill it with inertia and bureaucracy and whatever. And that's, even if you get paid, that's not the world's greatest outcome. You wanted to spread the technology more broadly across the industry, as I recall.
And I think Mike brought this up earlier, or maybe it was you, that the problem is that fund cycles matter. Venture investors, they're willing to put money in, and if it's early in the fund, okay, 7, 8, 9 years, they're kind of happy. But at some point, the pressure starts increasing of wanting to see liquidity. And I would say Mike's the exception. He's able to really go after biology, show that critical data set, or generate that critical data set that shows value creation, and then return capital. In my case, it's very different. It takes a long time to build a platform that is broadly recognized, and the last thing you want to do is at that point be forced to sell the company or go public. And again, there's now different, I don't want to spend time on this, but there's different mechanisms of doing that, which didn't exist 5 years ago.
Yeah, he's like the outlier. He's like the Instagram of biotech. Like 2 years in, boom, sell the company,
no, but
making it look easy.
I think Mike occupies a really sort of special niche there. And again, I think it goes back to his love, perhaps, because he sees interest in biology and can quickly figure out what's the key thing to turn this hypothesis of this biology may actually help patients into something that people credibly believe could be a treatment and pay meaningful money for.
Well, and I appreciate that somewhat mystical answer that you gave there about how do you know you've fallen in love with that next thing, because that's a very hard thing. I mean, and it reminds me of something Katrine Bosley said when I was reporting this article, and that is like she went traveling after selling Avila. She traveled the world and took some time off, recharged her batteries, and then she found one of these flexible entrepreneur in residence gigs for a while at the Broad Institute, which helped her size up a lot of different opportunities. And then the moment came for her with Editas. It was
But I
right.
can assure you, and I say this with all the love in my heart for Katrine, who's a very good friend, that process was supported by like a 30-tab Excel spreadsheet, right?
Some
so
people are methodical that way.
Yeah, there was a lot of analysis that went into that, for sure.
Yeah. Are there any other questions out there? If not, thanks to our panel. Great discussion. Appreciate it, guys.
Thanks, Luke.